You are listening to the Unslaved Podcast. Please welcome Michael Tsarion and David Whitehead.
Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to the Unslaved Podcast. Pleasure to be here. And we are back with Michael Black. He's joining us here once again. We had him on a few weeks back. You definitely have to go back and check out that show. It was a fantastic episode. And we're going to be continuing on this discussion, talking about some of the world wars, some of history, to try to provide more context for you about what's going on in the world right now. All right, and that's what we're really trying to get into here. So welcome back, Michael Black. Thanks for joining us here once again, my friend.
It's a pleasure to be here again. It's great to be able to speak to you guys more. It was such a fantastic conversation the last time that I thought it'd be a great idea for us to have another one as well. So here we are.
Absolutely. And your videos have been fantastic. And you can check Michael Black out on YouTube. Follow him. He's got some excellent content coming out for you. Man, it's almost daily. I see stuff coming up. I know you got lots of video projects on the way, but we're going to get into some of your work, Michael, and also Michael Tsarion is here. We've got some slides we're going to be going over with you, but I'm going to open up with this quote. It comes from Admiral Tirpitz from 1915. He's talking about the wars, and he's saying, "This war is the greatest lunacy ever committed by the white races." So Michael Tsarion, over to you, my friend.
Thanks, and welcome, Michael. It's nice to have you back, and I know you have some very cogent things to say about this aftermath. But yeah, if we go to the first slide, just for people who are new to this kind of history, I would just see the dates, because the aftermath of the First World, the First World War set up the situation, the Versailles Treaty and stuff, to create the Second World War. So there's the dates. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, 4 years. And then that was called the Great War, but really the one we want to focus on today is the second. It's World War II, 1939 to 1945. And to me, that all of our history, all of our modern, all the things you see around you today, date from that time. Arguably, one could say, the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. And there are writers that do that. They go back to the 1918. They go back to 17 and 18, 1917, 18. And that's where they're looking. But really, to me, that was just sort of that set the stage, so to speak. But the changes that happened there with the Bolshevik Revolution didn't necessarily in and of itself change the destiny of Europe. It certainly was a major factor, but the First and Second World War, and the Second World War, in my opinion, most importantly, really changed things. And again, today we want to put the focus on maybe World War II and the aftermath. I think that we'll also leave the gangster list, the list of gangsters. We'll have to do on another separate podcast, all the figures that were involved in these tremendous changes. But after World War I, the main thing to note about that is that the face of Europe and the Middle East changed, didn't it? There was all these new countries. There was also the great thrones, the great imperial thrones of countries like Austro-Hungary, Germany, Prussia, Italy, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, and even Yugoslavia are destroyed. And then out of the ashes of the First World War comes a lot of countries that we haven't really heard of before, or who never played a major role in European politics. And now suddenly all these little nothing states, there were fractured groups, even Poland to that extent, fractured, broken up, and now they emerge from the flames of the First World War and have a great say in the aftermath. Suddenly, and is that right? Something we take for granted, but is it right that little countries that almost, were swamped by the greater empires now, their say about the way things should be, is coloring the future, and people can look at that and say, yeah, well, that's a good thing. But by another platform, you can say, well, maybe not, because a lot of those potentates and diplomats and statesmen and leaders that came out of those little countries, they're anti-German. They tend to have an anti-German bias, you see, very viciously so. And then, of course, what happened to it? Then the next thing you know, after the First World War, is the communization of a lot of those countries. Russia is the number one to fall, but then a lot of other ones fell as well. And after the Second World War, that process of communization, countries in Europe being put under ice basically for decades happened. So you may not like Germany. Okay, well, you got the next best thing then. Did you like it? After the fall of Czechoslovakia and Romania and Bulgaria, I can't say anybody, even the commies in those countries, can't really attest and salute the program that they had to endure for decades, let alone anti-communist. It was the biggest nightmare of all. Well, you didn't want Germany. Yeah, you didn't want to partner up there. You had all these problems. Well, okay, then you got something next. So what does that tell us about the aftermath? In your desire to, and then of course the Versailles Treaty, which set up, as I said, the movement to actually create the Second World War erupted, and then the Bolshevization of Russia, which we'll talk about probably, hopefully, a little bit later as well. But that all of that leads to our times, to the creation of the League of Nations, then the United Nations, which is not under sort of Anglo-Saxons necessarily or Germans. It's under Slavs and under, again, a parliament of different voices, and that could be looked at as well. And of course, those two organizations, the United Nations, leads to the EU. These are the brainchilds of people like Jean Monnet and George Soros and Brzezinski and Edward Heath and many others, figures that as we move up through the 60s into modern times, and these are all sort of henchmen, this kind of United States of Europe, basically, that comes out of the aftermath of Second World War is their brainchild. And it's also favored by Illuminists and Freemasons, making the world safe for democracy. So it's very, very important to look back at these movements of history and these orgs. And of course, these orgs, these League of Nations, these United Nations, they fell like hyenas, you see, on Germany, tearing it to pieces, denying Germany its colonies, imposing colossal reparations, billions of marks beyond what anybody in Germany could ever pay. It forced the Germans to feel guilty about their past. That's why there is no real Germany today at all. It's just a raped husk is what we're talking about, where the citizens are brainwashed and guilt-ridden and servile to this EU monstrosity, you see. So, and then let's go to Britain. What happened? I mean, Michael, what will confirm this, that although the war ended, we saw the dates there in 1945. Actually, rations and want went on for 5 to even 10 years. Actually, the war didn't end for the British. The rations, which were meant to fade away rather quickly, within a year or two, and this included trains and the delivery of certain vital goods to the cities. No, that even 10 years later, things were still almost in a sort of an impoverished state. And then followed by that period, say 1950 to 55, then finally you start to get the first signs of the so-called affluence. And even that's a bit of a joke. But also it included the debauchery, the decadence, the profligacy, the so-called freedoms that you start seeing more in the swinging 60s and the 70s, right? And then you have these superficial sense of commercial progress with the cities going up, and it feels like there's real material progress. But that then leads to industrial meltdown, as it did in America, and then outsourcing, right where we are today, you see. So was that really a genuine progress that helped the nations? So my personal opinion is that every negative of our times, and there's colossal negatives, especially if you look at the headlines today, can and must be traced to the aftermath of the Second World War. It doesn't deny earlier dates, but this is the supreme date in my mind, starting in 1939, right? And even people like Pat Buchanan, whose book we should look at a bit later, he wrote a great book. He does indict England, actually. He indicts Britain because he says that Britain's intervention turned what would have been small little conflicts, relatively small conflicts in Europe. It's Britain that nudged it into colossal conflicts of World War. So Pat Buchanan indicts Britain as getting involved and pushing things to, a critical situation. So, we can maybe, those are just a few highlights filling in the background. Michael, do you have anything to add to that? And what is your overall consensus anyway of the aftermath of Second World War and the destruction of Germany? How do you frame that in your own mind?
Well, the Second World War essentially set the stage for the powers that should not be to completely usurp power from those systems that were already in place in various countries. And you mentioned the Treaty of Versailles. One of the key points about that, I would add this with regards to that, is that it was enforced by the Bank of International Settlements, which very few people know about, and few people less so understand exactly what role they played in offloading these reparations onto Germany, which were unpayable, as you correctly said. So what that led to was the banking cartels essentially destroying the root core of Germany, first and foremost, because the German peoples at that time, the Volk, were very awake to what was happening in the world, and they had seen it this destruction that had been wrought on their own populace, which we can go into later on as well. So we saw all of that happen, and I think it's such a terrible thing that has been done to the German people, in that they're forced to carry this shame for the actions of those power brokers that, again, usurped power even in Germany and pushed forward the National Socialist movement. This is something else a whole lot of people don't get, that the National Socialist movement, the clues in the name, was in fact socialist. It was inspired by the same ideologies that led to the creation of communism and the communist Soviet Union, just in a nationalized form. Where the Soviet Union had this idea of international communism, the Nazi Party, as it was termed, had this idea of national socialism. But they were both essentially working towards the same thing, which is a totalitarian system. The difference was that the German peoples, because it was national in nature, the German peoples did become strengthened in the first years of the power dynamics that developed in Weimar Germany, in the Weimar Republic in the 30s. But then what happened was, because they got too powerful, because they were starting to get too clued in, and they began to realize that communism was essentially the greater threat, they then had to be demolished and destroyed, which is why you saw the Second World War come to fruition in the way that it did, and why Britain played the role that it did. And also in terms of America's role in the Second World War, when it came to FDR, of course, was a Democrat, and he wanted to try and push forward his own ideological agenda, which furthered international communism, which not a lot of people, again, understand. They view FDR as a great president. In point of fact, he got America involved in a needless war, which they did not need to be in the first place. So there were a lot of moves made on the global chessboard, let's say, to further this international communist agenda, and one of those involved the destruction of Germany. And the second part of that, once Germany was destroyed after the Second World War, was to subjugate the German people by indoctrinating them, by feeding them this false history with regards to their past. And so if you can make people feel a sense of perpetual shame about these crimes that were done in their name, they didn't participate in them, and most of the people who were involved in the Second World War are all dead. But to this day, they're forced to carry this burden for things that were never their responsibility. And of course, communism and socialism always do this. It's a case of blaming the future generations for the sins of their ancestors, which is illogical. It's immoral, quite honestly, because the only person you can be responsible for, the only actions you can be responsible for in any real sense, are your own. So that's what I would say with regards to that. I think there has been a push towards destroying European white identity. And I say this, and I say this multiple times through my own videos as well, that I see this as a non-white individual. Now, I don't like identity politics in any way, shape, or form, but if they're going to frame it in the sense of, well, white people are the devil incarnate, well, then somebody has to stand up and say, hold on a second, that is simply not the case. Right? You've been demonized. You've been forced to believe this garbage about your heritage because of a small point in history. It's an important point, and the fact that people lost their lives is also important, and I don't think we should forget that. But at the same time, to be hitting people over the head constantly with this is completely irrational. It's completely illogical, and what that has led to is this ultimate cowardice in the West now, where they're faced with these dominating cultures from the Middle East, who are now attempting to yet again reshape and remold the face of Europe. So I think we've got a lot of things that we need to cast off with regards to these shackles of slavery that have been placed, bizarrely enough, on white people. We're told that white people were the ultimate